Before I tell you what happened, leave a comment and tell me how old you are, where you are from, and whether you are in a relationship or thinking about someone right now. You never know who might read your story and feel a little less alone. I thought the worst moment of my life had already happened. I was wrong. My name is Claire Bennett, and the day everything changed began in a parking garage beneath the headquarters of Hayes Technologies. Just a few hours earlier, I discovered that the woman I loved had been planning her future without me for months. She was not angry. She was not cruel. Somehow that made it worse. She had simply decided that our lives were moving in different directions. 7 years together ended with a calm conversation and a suitcase by the front door. By the time I arrived at work that morning, I felt like a stranger inside my own life. I answered emails, I attended meetings, I smiled when coworkers greeted me. Every smile felt fake, every word felt heavy. Around 3 o'clock, I escaped to the parking garage for a few minutes of silence. The air smelled faintly of rain and concrete. I stood beside my car, staring at my phone, rereading the final message she had sent me. It was kind. It was mature. It broke my heart anyway. I kept wondering how someone could stop choosing you while standing right beside you. I was so lost in my thoughts that I did not hear the footsteps at first. When I finally looked up, my breath caught. Victoria Hayes was standing a few feet away. At 48, she was one of the most respected CEOs in the country. People at the company spoke about her with equal parts admiration and fear. She built businesses, closed impossible deals, and never seemed uncertain about anything. Yet as she stood there looking at me, I noticed something unexpected in her green eyes. Concern. I quickly wiped my face and straightened my posture. "Miss Hayes," I said, "I did not realize anyone was here." "Clearly," she replied softly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped against the entrance ramp in the distance. Then Victoria surprised me. "Claire," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I need a favor." I blinked in disbelief. Out of all the things I expected to hear from the most powerful woman in the building, those 4 words were not one of them, and what she asked next would change both of our lives forever. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. Victoria Hayes did not ask employees for favors. She gave instructions, made decisions, and solved problems that affected thousands of people. Yet there she stood in the parking garage, looking at me with an expression that seemed almost hesitant. "A favor?" I asked. She nodded. "Yes." I glanced around the empty concrete structure as if someone might jump out and explain this strange situation. Nobody did. Rain continued tapping softly outside. "What kind of favor?" Victoria took a slow breath. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain, not weak, not nervous, just careful. "My younger sister is getting married next weekend in California," she said. "Most of my family will be there." I waited for the rest. "And?" A faint smile appeared before quickly disappearing. "My family has a habit of becoming overly interested in my personal life. That sounds exhausting." "It is." She looked toward the rain for a moment. "Especially this year." Something in her voice made me pay closer attention. This was not the confident executive I saw during company meetings. This was someone carrying a burden she rarely showed anyone. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Victoria met my eyes. "I need someone to attend the wedding with me." I blinked. "You need a date?" "Something like that." I stared at her for several seconds. "There are probably hundreds of people who would say yes to that." "I am aware." "Then why ask me?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment she said nothing. Then she answered so quietly I almost missed it. "Because I trust you." My heart skipped. Of all the answers I expected, that was not one of them. "You barely know me." A small smile touched her lips. "You would be surprised." Before I could respond, she continued, "Claire, I am asking you to pretend to be my girlfriend for the wedding weekend." The words landed like a thunderclap. I stared at her. She stared back. Neither of us moved. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious." I laughed once from pure disbelief. "This is insane." "Probably. You are the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar company. That part is still true. Despite myself, I almost smiled. Victoria folded her arms. You do not have to answer right now. The relief in her voice suggested she had expected me to refuse immediately. Think about it. Why me? I asked again. This time her expression softened. Because when most people look at me, they see a title. Her green eyes held mine. You look at me like I am a person. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything either of us had said. And as I stood there listening to the rain fall beyond the garage entrance, I realized saying no might be far more difficult than it should have been. I spent the entire evening trying to convince myself that the conversation in the parking garage had never happened. Unfortunately, every time I closed my eyes, I saw Victoria standing there, looking at me with an honesty that did not match the image I had built of her in my head. By the time I arrived home, my apartment felt emptier than ever. The silence seemed louder. Every room reminded me of plans that no longer existed. I ordered takeout I barely touched and spent most of the night staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to send Victoria a message and decline immediately. Another part wanted to know why the most powerful woman I had ever met believed I was the only person she could trust. Around 9 o'clock, my phone finally lit up. The message was simple: take all the time you need. Whatever you decide, there will be no pressure from me. Victoria. I read it 3 times, then a fourth. Something about the message surprised me. There was no attempt to persuade me, no executive confidence, no expectation, just patience. The next morning, I arrived at Hayes Technologies exhausted from lack of sleep. I buried myself in meetings and project reviews, hoping work would distract me. It did not. Around noon, a calendar notification appeared on my screen. Executive Office, 1 o'clock. Requested by Victoria Hayes. My pulse immediately quickened. By 1 o'clock, I was standing outside the executive suite on the top floor. The assistant greeted me warmly and guided me into Victoria's office. The room overlooked nearly all of downtown Chicago. Sunlight reflected across glass towers in every direction. Victoria stood near the windows, holding a tablet. When she saw me, she set it aside. Thank you for coming. You requested the meeting. A small smile appeared. Fair point. She motioned toward a chair. I sat down while she took the seat across from me instead of behind her desk. The decision felt intentional, less executive, more personal. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she slid a folder across the table. Inside were travel details, hotel reservations, event schedules, and information about the wedding weekend. You planned everything already? I asked. Victoria looked almost embarrassed. I was optimistic. I laughed despite myself. That is one word for it. Her smile widened briefly before fading. Claire, if the answer is no, I will understand. There it was again. No pressure, no manipulation, just honesty. I looked down at the folder. California, 4 days. An entirely ridiculous situation. Yet something still did not make sense. Why me? I asked for the third time. Victoria became very still. Then she leaned back slightly and folded her hands. 3 years ago, during the restructuring process, your department was under review. I frowned. I never knew that. Most employees did not. Her eyes held mine. Several departments were going to lose funding. A strange feeling settled inside my chest. What changed? I read a proposal you submitted. I blinked. A branding strategy report? Victoria nodded. It was exceptional. I stared at her. You remember that? I remember people who impress me. Heat rushed into my face. Victoria continued before I could respond. You approached a difficult problem with creativity, honesty, and empathy. Most people focus on numbers. You focused on people. The room suddenly felt smaller. That report helped save your division. I did not know what to say. For years, I had assumed nobody important ever noticed my work, yet Victoria had remembered it in detail. After that, she said quietly, I paid attention to your career. My heart skipped. You did? Every major project, every promotion, every success. For a second, neither of us looked away. Then Victoria took a slow breath. That is why I trust you, Claire. Silence settled between us. Outside, sunlight filled the city skyline. Inside, something shifted. The proposal no longer felt completely impossible. And before I could talk myself out of it, I closed the folder and looked directly at her. "All right," I said softly. "I will go with you." The relief that flashed across Victoria's face lasted less than a second, but it was enough for me to realize how much my answer truly mattered to her. The days leading up to the trip passed faster than I expected. At first, I told myself this arrangement was simply a favor, a temporary role, a harmless performance that would end the moment we returned from California. But the more time I spent with Victoria, the harder it became to keep emotional distance between us. We met several times after work to prepare for the wedding weekend. The first meeting focused entirely on logistics. We reviewed travel schedules, family members, and details we might need if someone asked questions. The second meeting became more personal. Victoria explained that her family loved stories and remembered details. If we were going to make this believable, we needed to know more about each other. One evening, I arrived at her office after most employees had already gone home. The city outside glowed beneath a deep blue sunset. The executive floor was unusually quiet. Victoria sat at the conference table with 2 cups of coffee waiting. "I thought preparation would be more glamorous," I said as I took a seat. "You mean less paperwork?" she asked. "Exactly." A rare laugh escaped her. I was beginning to realize that Victoria smiled more often when nobody else was around. For the next hour, we practiced answers to imaginary questions: favorite restaurants, childhood memories, vacation destinations. The entire situation should have felt ridiculous. Instead, it felt strangely comfortable. Eventually, Victoria closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "New rule," she said. "That sounds dangerous." "Probably." Her eyes sparkled with amusement. "Tell me something true about yourself that most people do not know." I hesitated. "That is not part of the plan. Maybe it should be." I looked down at my coffee before answering. "When I was younger, I wanted to write novels." Victoria seemed genuinely surprised. "Really? I even started one." "What happened?" I smiled softly. "Life happened." For a moment, she looked thoughtful. Then she nodded. "I understand that. Your turn." That was not part of the agreement. Neither was my answer. She laughed quietly before looking toward the window. "I wanted to become an architect." I stared at her. "You?" Apparently that surprises everyone. A little. Most people assume I was born carrying business plans. I laughed. She laughed too. The sound filled the room and somehow made the space feel warmer. Over the following days, those conversations continued. We talked about books we loved, places we hoped to visit, and opportunities we missed. The more Victoria shared, the more I realized how different she was from the image everyone saw at work. Behind the confidence was someone carrying enormous pressure. Behind the success was someone surprisingly alone. One evening, we left the buildings together after another planning session. Rain was falling across downtown Chicago. We stood beneath the covered entrance, waiting for her driver. The city lights reflected across wet streets. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course. When was the last time you took a real vacation?" Victoria thought about it. "I honestly do not remember. That is not healthy." "You sound like my sister," I smiled. Then a more serious question slipped out before I could stop it. "Are you happy?" Victoria became very quiet. The rain seemed louder. Cars moved slowly through the street beyond us. Finally, she answered, "I am successful." It was not this answer. We both knew it. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then her driver arrived. Before stepping into the car, Victoria looked at me with an expression I could not quite understand. "Thank you, Claire." "For what?" Her smile was small but genuine. "For asking questions nobody else asks." The car disappeared into the rainy night a moment later, and as I stood there watching the taillights fade into the distance, I realized I was no longer nervous about the trip. What worried me now was how much I was beginning to care about the woman waiting at the end of it. Friday arrived sooner than I expected. By 7 o'clock that morning, I was standing inside a private terminal at O'Hare International Airport, wondering how my life had become so strange in such a short amount of time. 2 weeks earlier, I had been mourning the end of a 7-year relationship. Now I was preparing to spend an entire wedding weekend with the most powerful woman in my company. The terminal was quiet and elegant. Sunlight poured through enormous windows overlooking the runway. Everything felt polished, organized, and far removed from my normal life. "You look nervous." I turned and found Victoria walking toward me carrying a small travel bag. Even dressed casually, she carried herself with the same quiet confidence that seemed to follow her everywhere. "I am trying to decide whether this is exciting or completely insane," I admitted. A smile appeared. "The correct answer is probably both." Despite my nerves, I laughed. The private jet waiting outside still felt impossible to process. The flight itself was unlike anything I had experienced before. No crowded boarding lines, no noisy terminals, no rushing passengers, just comfortable seats, endless clouds, and hours of uninterrupted conversation. At first, we talked about work, then books, then travel. Somewhere over the Midwest, the conversation shifted naturally into family. Victoria stared out the window for a moment before speaking. "My sister is excited to meet you." "That sounds dangerous." "You are not wrong," I smiled. "What about your parents?" Victoria hesitated. "They mean well." The answer made me laugh. "That bad?" "You will see." For a moment, she looked almost nervous. Seeing that expression on her face felt strangely humanizing. The woman who could negotiate multi-million-dollar deals without hesitation was worried about a family wedding. Hours later, California appeared beneath us. Rolling hills stretched across the landscape. The sunlight seemed warmer than Chicago. The air smelled different when we stepped outside. Cleaner, softer. A black SUV waited nearby to drive us to the estate. As we traveled through wine country, vineyards covered the hills in every direction. The scenery looked like something from a movie. Eventually, enormous gates appeared ahead of us. Beyond them stood a breathtaking estate surrounded by vineyards and ancient oak trees. My jaw nearly dropped. "This is your family home?" I asked. Victoria looked out the window and sighed. "Unfortunately, yes," I laughed. The SUV stopped near the entrance. Staff members moved across the property, preparing for the wedding weekend. Guests gathered on terraces overlooking the vineyards. Everything felt larger than life. Suddenly, my confidence disappeared. "Victoria." "Yes. What if somebody realizes we are pretending?" She turned toward me. For a second, the noise outside seemed to disappear. Then she reached over and gently took my hand. "They will not," she said softly. Her fingers were warm. Her voice was calm. And for reasons I could not explain, I believed her. Together, we stepped out of the vehicle and into a world that would change both of our lives in ways neither of us could yet imagine. The first evening at the estate felt like stepping into another world. Everywhere I looked, people seemed effortlessly elegant. Guests wandered through vineyard paths carrying glasses of sparkling water and wine. Soft music drifted through the warm California air. The golden light of sunset stretched across the hills, making everything appear almost unreal. Through it all, Victoria remained beside me. Sometimes she quietly introduced me to relatives. Sometimes she leaned close enough to explain complicated family connections before I became completely lost. The gesture was small, but I appreciated it more than she probably realized. Dinner that evening took place on a massive terrace overlooking the vineyards. Long tables were covered with flowers and candles. The entire valley glowed beneath the setting sun. I found myself seated between Victoria and her younger sister Emily. Within minutes, I understood why Victoria had warned me about her family. "So," Emily said with a smile, "how exactly did the two of you meet?" I nearly dropped my fork. Across the table, Victoria looked perfectly calm. "Through work," she answered smoothly. "That sounds boring," Emily replied immediately. Laughter spread around the table. "Most good love stories are more interesting than that." "Not oursers," Victoria said. The interesting part happened later. Her eyes briefly met mine. Heat rushed into my face. Fortunately, several people shifted the conversation before I was forced to invent details on the spot. As the evening continued, something unexpected happened. I began enjoying myself. Victoria's family was warm, funny, and surprisingly welcoming. They asked questions, shared stories, teased one another constantly. For the first time in weeks, I laughed without forcing it. Yet every now and then, I caught Victoria watching me. Not in a possessive way, more like someone making sure I was comfortable. It was thoughtful, it was kind, and it made it increasingly difficult to remember that none of this was supposed to be real. Later that night, after most guests had disappeared inside, I stepped onto a quiet balcony overlooking the vineyards. Moonlight covered the hills in silver light. The estate behind me glowed softly against the darkness. I closed my eyes and breathed in the cool night air. I thought I might find you here. I turned and saw Victoria standing in the doorway holding a mug of tea. Could not sleep, she asked. Too much happening. A knowing smile appeared. I understand. She joined me at the railing. For a while, we simply stood together watching the moonlit landscape. The silence felt comfortable. Then Victoria surprised me. Do you remember the branding proposal from 3 years ago? I laughed softly. The famous report? It was not famous. Apparently, it was famous enough for a chief executive officer to remember it. Victoria smiled before looking out toward the vineyards. I read it 3 times. I stared at her. 3 times? She nodded. It was one of the most thoughtful reports I had seen in years. I did not know what to say. The compliment felt more personal now than it had in Chicago. Perhaps because there were no conference rooms here, no offices, no titles. Just two people standing beneath the stars. Victoria's voice became quieter. After that report, I paid attention whenever your name appeared. My pulse quickened. Why? For a moment she said nothing. Then she turned toward me. Her expression was open in a way I had never seen before. Because I thought you were extraordinary, Claire. The breeze moved gently through the vineyards below us. Somewhere in the distance, music continued playing. But in that moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. Sleep was almost impossible after that conversation on the balcony. Long after Victoria returned to her room, I remained outside staring across the moonlit vineyards. Extraordinary. The word echoed inside my mind again and again. No one had ever looked at me the way Victoria had looked at me when she said it. There had been no performance in her voice, no obligation, no pretense, just honesty. That should have made me happy. Instead, it terrified me. The next morning, the estate came alive before sunrise. Wedding preparations were everywhere. Staff moved between buildings carrying flowers and decorations. Guests gathered on terraces, overlooking the valley. Music drifted through open windows. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. Inside, I felt increasingly confused. Every time I saw Victoria, my heart reacted before my brain could catch up. During breakfast, she smiled at me from across the table. During the rehearsal, she stood beside me so naturally that it almost felt real. By midday, I needed a few minutes alone to clear my thoughts. I wandered through a quieter section of the estate, near several administrative offices. The area was mostly empty. I had no destination in mind. I simply wanted silence. As I approached a stone courtyard, voices drifted from a partially open office door. I immediately recognized one of them. It belonged to Victoria's older brother, Daniel Hayes. I had met him briefly the previous evening. The board vote is getting closer, Daniel said. Another man responded. Several investors are still undecided. I slowed without meaning to. Public perception matters right now, Daniel continued. Especially after everything that happened this year. My stomach tightened. The relationship helps, the other man said. People see stability. They see someone grounded. A strange feeling settled inside my chest. At least it gives Victoria an advantage going into the vote, Daniel replied. Silence followed. I stood frozen. Board vote, investors, public perception, the words repeated inside my head. Suddenly, every piece of the puzzle seemed to rearrange itself. Victoria needed someone to attend the wedding. Victoria needed someone she trusted. Victoria needed someone who could help create stability. Was that all I had been? I stepped away before either man noticed me. My pulse pounded in my ears. For the rest of the afternoon, I struggled to focus on anything else. The wedding ceremony itself was beautiful. White flowers lined the aisle. The California sun cast golden light across the vineyards. Family members smiled through tears of happiness. Guests applauded as the couple exchanged vows. Yet, even surrounded by joy, my thoughts remained trapped elsewhere. Every glance from Victoria felt different now. Every smile carried questions I could not answer. Had she told me the truth, or had she only told me part of it? The uncertainty was exhausting. That evening, guests gathered for the reception beneath hundreds of glowing lights suspended above the vineyard. Music filled the air. Laughter echoed across the valley. Everyone seemed carefree except me. Eventually, I slipped away from the crowd and walked toward the edge of the clack, property where rows of grapevines stretched into the darkness. There you are. I turned. Victoria was standing a few feet away. Her expression softened the moment she saw me. I have been looking for you. I forced a smile that felt completely unnatural. I just needed some air. Concern appeared in her eyes. Claire, what is wrong? The question should have been simple. Instead, it felt impossible. I wanted to tell her what I had heard. I wanted to ask why she never mentioned a board vote. I wanted to know whether any of this had been real. But fear stopped me. Fear that I already knew the answer. Nothing, I said quietly. Victoria looked unconvinced. Claire. Hearing my name in her voice almost broke my resolve. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. The music continued behind us. The vineyard stretched silently into the night. And for the first time since meeting Victoria Hayes in that parking garage, I was no longer sure I could trust what my heart was telling me. The reception continued around me, but everything felt distant. Music drifted through the vineyard. Guests laughed beneath strings of glowing lights. Glasses clinked. Conversations blended together. Yet none of it seemed real anymore. All I could hear were the words I had overheard earlier: board vote, investors, public perception, stability. The more I thought about them, the more impossible it became to ignore the doubts growing inside me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Victoria standing on the balcony, telling me I was extraordinary. Then I remembered the conversation between her brother and the investor. The contrast left me exhausted. By sunrise, I had made a decision. I needed answers. The estate was unusually quiet that morning. Most guests were still asleep after the celebration. I packed my suitcase slowly while sunlight spread across the vineyards outside my window. Part of me hoped I was wrong. Part of me hoped Victoria would explain everything and make the confusion disappear. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Victoria stood in the hallway. She looked tired. Concern filled her eyes the moment she saw the suitcase. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I stepped aside. She entered the room, and for several seconds neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Victoria looked at the packed bag and immediately understood. "You heard something yesterday. It was not a question." "Yes." She closed her eyes briefly before taking a slow breath. "I thought so." My chest tightened. "Why did you not tell me about the board vote?" Victoria looked toward the window before meeting my eyes again. "Because I did not want this to become about that. But it is about that." The words came out sharper than I intended. "Your brother practically said this relationship helps your public image." Pain flickered across her face. "Claire, please listen. Was I part of a strategy?" The question hung between us. Victoria immediately shook her head. "No. Then why does it look that way?" Silence filled the room. The hesitation hurt more than any answer could have. "The board situation is real," she finally admitted, "and I should have told you." I looked away. Hearing the admission felt like losing something I had already started to treasure. "You asked me to trust you." Her voice became almost a whisper. I know, and I did. Neither of us spoke. The room felt painfully small. For the first time since arriving in California, I saw genuine fear in Victoria's eyes. Not fear of losing a board vote, not fear of losing a company, fear of losing me. Unfortunately, that realization came too late. I picked up my suitcase. I think I need to leave. Victoria stared at me for several seconds. Then she nodded once. If that is what you need. I wanted her to stop me. I wanted her to give me a reason to stay. Instead, she respected my decision. Somehow that made leaving even harder. By noon, we were driving toward the airport. The vineyards rolled past outside the windows. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. The silence felt endless. When we finally arrived at the private terminal, reality settled over me. This was really happening. I turned toward Victoria one last time. The woman who had changed my life in a parking garage now looked more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. Goodbye, Victoria. Her expression softened. Goodbye, Claire. I boarded the plane moments later. As California disappeared beneath the clouds, an ache settled deep inside my chest. I told myself I was protecting my heart. I told myself I was doing the right thing. Yet somewhere above the Pacific coast, a terrible thought refused to leave me. What if I had just walked away from the one person who truly saw me for who I was? 3 weeks passed after I returned to Chicago. 3 weeks of silence. 3 weeks of convincing myself that leaving California had been the right decision. Every morning I buried myself in work. Every evening I returned to an apartment that felt far too quiet. Yet no matter how busy I became, I could not stop thinking about Victoria. Then the headlines appeared. One article became five. Five became dozens. Business websites, financial reports, and industry publications all carried the same story. Victoria Hayes was no longer the chief executive officer of Hayes Technologies. The board vote had happened, and she had lost. I stared at the article on my screen for several minutes. The photograph showed Victoria standing outside company headquarters. She looked composed, professional, strong. Most people would have believed she was fine. I knew better. I remembered the woman who admitted she could not remember her last vacation. The woman who watched moonlit vineyards in silence. The woman who thanked me simply for asking questions nobody else asked. Suddenly, none of the business headlines mattered. All I could think about was whether she was alone. A few days later, I returned to my desk after lunch and found an envelope waiting for me. There was no company logo, no return address, just my name written neatly across the front. My heart immediately recognized the handwriting. Inside was a short note. Claire, there are things I should have told you sooner. If you are willing, meet me tomorrow at 7 o'clock. The address was written beneath the message. I read it 4 times before finally folding it and slipping it into my bag. The next evening, I found myself standing outside a small lakeside cafe north of the city. Rain fell softly across the water. Warm light glowed through large windows overlooking the lake. Through the glass, I spotted Victoria sitting alone at a table near the window. No assistants, no executives, no board members, just Victoria. She looked up when I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. It was smaller than before, more uncertain, more real. Thank you for coming, she said quietly. I sat down across from her. You look different. A soft laugh escaped her. Losing a company has a way of changing your schedule. Despite everything, I smiled. The tension eased slightly. Coffee arrived. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Finally, Victoria folded her hands together. You deserve the truth. I listened while she explained everything. The board pressure, the investors, the mistakes she made by trying to keep those problems separate from the relationship she was building with me. I should have told you sooner, she admitted. I thought I was protecting something important. Her eyes met mine. Instead, I damaged it. Neither of us looked away. The board vote was real, she continued, but it was never the reason I asked you to come with me. My chest tightened. Then why did you? Victoria took a slow breath. Because I trusted you. Because I admired you. Because somewhere between reading your proposal and standing with you in California, you became the person I wanted beside me. The cafe seemed to disappear around us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Victoria said the words I had been carrying in my heart for weeks. Losing my position hurt. Losing you hurt more. My eyes immediately filled with emotion. Not because she was a former chief executive officer. Not because she had once controlled a multi-billion-dollar company, but because she was finally standing in front of me without any walls. No title, no image, no distance, just honesty. I reached across the table and gently took her hand. Surprise appeared in her eyes before slowly giving way to relief. "You should have trusted me," I said softly. "I know. And you were incredibly frustrating." Victoria laughed for the first time all evening. "I know that too," I smiled. The rain continued falling outside. The lake stretched quietly into the darkness. For the first time since this story began, everything felt simple. Not perfect, not easy, just honest. Victoria squeezed my hand gently. I squeezed back, and in that moment, I knew we were no longer pretending to be anything. We were simply two women choosing each other. If this story touched your heart, comment the number 8.